Hey friends, welcome to the Scars Podcast. I'm Nola Kaysen, the Girls Ministry Director.
And I'm Jesus Aviles. I'm one of your pastors here at Celebration Baptist Church. And the interviews that you're going to experience are supplementary in terms of providing the therapeutic perspective to our 4-part sermon series.
Let's hop into today's interview. We have with us today Dr. Smith. So I'm going to start with a couple of opening questions to help us get to know you a little bit better before we get started into the sermon-specific questions. Share with us who you are, where you're serving, and how the Lord led you to being a biblical mental health practitioner.
Well, I think at 19, I decided I would be a therapist. And so that was a long time ago. Mm-hmm. Now, how I got here is too long a story in the short period of time that we have. But basically, I ended up deciding that I didn't have the looks or the clothes to be a good therapist. So I decided to become a professor instead and then do therapy at night. Well, that was a little arrogant. Becoming a professor was actually a full-time job. And so I didn't have the time to become a full-time therapist at night. So I studied therapy. And then I did a little bit when I could. And that was about 40 years ago. So I've spent 40 years studying therapy, doing therapy on the side at times in various places. I traveled around the U.S. giving talks on this and done research on it. So basically, I'm just kind of a recovering professor. How's that?
Would you mind me asking you, what are some of the top topics that you had that you've traveled around giving? Just, a couple just for us to...
Well, probably the one that was was on abstinence education. Basically, is how to keep kids from having sex. And so
you're going to be invited back for another sermon. I just want to let you go. Go ahead.
But I can also tell you that based upon the research I did over many years, there's no way to keep kids from having sex. That's basically was the result of the research. No matter what you try to teach them, no matter what you tell them, kids will do what kids will do. And so they follow their heart. So that means you have to get to them early, and you got to get them so that they believe in it. Because by the time they're 12, 13, it's hard to start teaching them. Because it goes in and then it goes out.
Right.
Okay. So, no. So that did a lot of work on that. But basically, I'm just a professor, did research on therapy, did a little therapy on the side, and tried to learn over a long period of time.
All right. We look forward to getting to learn what you learned. So we'll do that.
Okay, so now we're going to get into a definition of trauma. Can you define trauma for us and even different types of trauma, if possible?
Actually, the term trauma wasn't really something I became aware of, but then I started teaching this course. It's psychopathology. It's the study of mental illness, but more specifically, it's giving diagnoses. One such diagnosis is trauma. So then psychiatrists use a number of criteria by which they define trauma. Okay, so that has a very specific meaning. But the problem is that's changed over the decades. So what trauma is it's a moving target. It is not any one thing. And so for people to say it's one thing or the other, or sure, but remember, it has changed so much over the years, it's hard to know exactly what it is. I think it's safe to say that it's an individual thing. Each person will say what trauma is for themselves. Now, would I think of it as trauma? I mean, they might say they had a bad hair day and that was traumatizing, and I'd go, a bad hair day is a bad hair day. Not sure how it's trauma, but for that person, it was traumatic. So it's really being respectful of each person's experience, definition, how they present their trauma. So to some extent, when people, say they're traumatized, I'll be quiet and silent and try to listen. But I won't really know what that means until they give me more context, until they tell me how trauma has affected them personally.
So let me ask, we're obviously at a church, we've got multi-generational. So if the term and its definition has developed, right, expanded, contracted along the way, any guidance you can possibly give, let's just say a parent having a kid and who wants to talk about a traumatic experience where the definitions are completely at odds.
Right.
I didn't know if there's any guidance you can kind of provide.
Well, for a kid to say they've been traumatized, that's not kid language. I'd be very curious, very worried. How did the kid learn the word trauma? What does that mean to the kid? I mean, so that would be the first thing that comes to my mind, because something's odd there about that language. It might be something that happened to somebody, and they learned somehow, their friend, teacher, that what happened to them was trauma. So that may be what happened. So it's really listening to kind of what is kind of a normal way, kids will talk. And then if all of a sudden they say something about trauma, that should perk up your ears, because that's an unusual thing for any child to say.
That's excellent. I mean, it's very easy when you hear a term, you're like, the kid doesn't even know what that means, just brush it off. Mm-hmm. But from your explanation of it, the fact that a kid brought up the term, that should raise a red flag, raise an eyebrow, perk up your ears.
Very, very much so.
Yeah.
Excellent. And so, in terms of trauma, after it's been experienced, many manifestations in terms of what can be displayed and what can be thought about. But I want to specifically go into a type of expression or a type of feeling of loneliness and isolation. If you wouldn't mind just honing in on that.
Sure.
And just tell us a little bit about that in terms of your...
Well, most of the people that I've seen who've been traumatized, they will feel like their community has kind of been come down to one themselves, because they will feel alone at that point. Because, questions like, why me, will be coming to their mind. And so that will be just playing through their mind. They may have tried reaching out to others and been told, basically, that's not a big deal, don't worry about it. Or, you'll get over it. I think Dr. Valentine talked about platitudes. Yeah, and so most of the people who've been traumatized have been told platitudes, which has unfortunately re-traumatized the person, because now they've been told you're not important. What you're saying is not real, and so therefore you're just making it up. That will give a sense of aloneness and loneliness, because then it's with the sense no one understands. So that's the reason why platitudes are so dangerous, because it leads to isolation and loneliness.
And if I could just say, this is specific to our audience, Dr. Smith had mentioned the name Dr. Valentine. Our audience won't be introduced to Dr. Valentine till episode 4, so hold on to that and continue to listen on. But Dr. Smith and Dr. Valentine are married. We were blessed to get them both here, but...
but wait, let me interrupt.
Yes, sir.
She's the A team. I'm the B team.
You're the B team.
Okay, so if you can, go with her, because she is the A team.
She's the A team. You got to get to episode 4 to get to the A team.
All right.
So just hold on to your horses. We'll get there. All right, so loneliness and isolation and that whole concept of a community of one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's very interesting, how you can think you're a community of one and be surrounded with a church body.
Right.
Or a family. What are all the things that kind of take place for somebody to get themselves in that isolated spot, right?
I think it's just a sense no one listens. So people can give good advice, they can be absolutely correct in everything they're saying, but they're not hearing a word that the person says. You've created than a community of one, because then no one's listening to them. And that's probably the one thing I see most often. I mean, people are good, but they just don't listen to each other because each person thinks they're good.
We're gonna have to pause that, and we just have to silent think about that. What we just said. That's excellent. So let me ask: when addressing loneliness and isolation, what are some healthy and unhealthy ways the person that went through that traumatic experience, how they've dealt with that? Just some examples of healthy and unhealthy, so we can keep an eye on stuff like that.
Well, part of part of the way I'm going to actually skip ahead to some of your other questions.
Yeah, great. Do what you got to do, Dr. Smith.
When I was 30, when I was around when I was about 25, I had to decide upon a dissertation topic. And so there were all sorts. But the one I chose was one where I could get paid $10,000 to do a research study.
Okay.
Because I was poor, I needed to eat, and $10,000 sounded like a lot of money. It was on marijuana abuse.
Okay.
Basically addictions. That led me into the area of addictions. And so when I became a professor after I graduated, then my topic then was addictions, which led me into 12 steps, which led me into the issue of God. Now, remember, I was a professor, so I looked at things really through trying to research it, understand it, kind of reading about it, etc. And so one of the things that I learned is, remember, with God, you're not alone. And in the 12 steps, community is built. And so it's in addictions I learned what community meant. Because I'm actually not an addict, so I couldn't go to a 12 steps meeting. But I read enough, I talked enough to people who were going to 12 steps, and again, did research on it, and by talking to people, and began to understand what does aloneness mean for them. Well, the whole thing about 12 steps then was just having people listen to you and understand where you're coming from. So that's probably where my understanding of the role of God came, was from talking to people who were addicts. Now, it doesn't mean that they were kind of healed overnight, or that they became great Christians. No, I'm a little more realist than that. But it certainly provides a pathway.
Okay. So it's in this unhealthy journey where
then arrogance, pride becomes the key issue. And it's their first statement: I can do it myself. I can control my use. That's a statement of pride, because by definition, and if you look at all the definitions of addiction, it all starts with the idea, I can do it myself. I can control my use. But they fail each time, which means they can't control their use. That means they need help. They need community. So, yeah, the issue of addictions and trauma, frankly, is the same thing. It's the issue of trying to control it yourself, trying to do it yourself, and failing and failing and failing, and having no one listen until you get to a community who can listen.
So I'm going to interrupt you for just a second and go back to kind of getting to know a little bit about who you are. You mentioned in the midst of your research of addiction and community and 12-step programs that led you to, okay, where does God fit in the midst of this? So can you share with us your salvation story, how you came to know the Lord personally?
Probably, some people talk about a mountaintop experience and et cetera, et cetera. I'm not sure I believe in a mountaintop experience. I think it happened over a period of years, and knowing something must be happening, because I've screwed up in so many ways that there is no reason that I should still be able to be successful as much as I am without there being God. And I think so. I had to be convinced, like any other good skeptic, and it was by just seeing evidence over and over and over again, until finally it's like, okay, I'm done. I've been convinced, Holy Spirit and God did it to me.
He did.
I didn't have any other choice.
Yeah. That's excellent. I think a lot of people would share that experience in terms of, I can't put my finger on it, but I was definitely walked to that point, and like, I'm just kind of here. Right? I'm just kind of like saved. I've just kind of been aware of the Lord's work. And so, excellent.
It took a long time, though.
It took a while.
Yeah.
A couple of years. You're in 30s now.
Yeah. Well, it took a long time. Professors, by definition, are arrogant. And their arrogance means that universities are, by and large, secular, which leads the whole business of being arrogant and prideful. Universities means that it's hard for them to be anything but either agnostic or atheists. It's the nature of being in a university. It's the self-sufficiency. That is the danger of being a professor.
So do you have thoughts or suggested criteria for those seeking professional counseling as they seek to deal with their trauma? How would you advise the person that knows that they need counseling to make sure that they see somebody who is trustworthy and going to point them towards truth?
Okay. Well, it's always important to realize that there's a readiness for change that could occur, but it may take a while because they may be ready one day and something happens and then all of a sudden they're not ready anymore. And so that's why this business of engaging a person into therapy, it really is engaging them, because just because they're ready one day doesn't mean they'll be ready the next day. So I think that's why the church is a great place for that, because it's a matter of patience and matter of having patience with people who just don't get it, that they're in a world of hurt, even if they're not willing to share that with other people. So maybe the best thing that can happen is just patience with people who have problems, but aren't willing to acknowledge it, aren't willing to almost become that vulnerable, because it is scary for people.
So question, Nola and I both being leaders within our specific church, right? We have kids and students kind of come to us to receive care. Any guidance in terms of at what particular point in our conversations, and Nola and I are both trained, I'm a school psychologist by training, just doing assessments, and Nola has her degree in biblical counseling. Any guidance on our end where this needs to now shift over into professional mental health care? Mm-hmm. Biblical, but still professional. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, there's all sorts of answers to that. I think when it's important for everyone, including people, everyone to know, okay, it's time for me to punt. Because the problem may be that, whatever group decides that they have answers. And I'm always very cautious of that. And so it's when they feel frustrated, when a person feels like they've done everything they can, then it's time to, yeah.
Now I asked that question in terms of, okay, church care for someone, but I mean, it could very easily just apply to family, right? The kids network, the adults network, so all of a sudden that support network, there is a time to punt. That is correct. That is correct.
But other therapists as well, because not all therapists are equally competent. I mean, part of what I taught at universities over 40 years, I taught therapists how to be therapists. And so I have this, I don't know how many hundreds and hundreds of people I've taught to be therapists. And so I have a very jaundiced opinion of the training people get to be therapists. And in the end, what the research always tends to show, it's the person, not the therapy. So you could know everything about how to do therapy and be a lousy therapist. But in the end, so it's really the training each person has, the understanding, the wisdom, which is why it's really hard for someone in their mid-20s to be a good therapist. They don't have the experience. They may not have the wisdom. Because in the end, therapy is not about technique. It's about the person and the person's ability to connect with other people. So.
That's excellent. And if I can add to that, Nola and I both working in the student ministry world, if we have volunteers, one of the things that we recommend is step into student ministry. Don't wait for your child to be student ministry aged to get ready. Come in, get some experience, work on some other people's kids, show them some love, occasionally practice the punt, right? We do all that. And so you have that little bit of and you'll hear more about it in episode 4, that whole development of the frontal cortex. Get that experience and stuff,
Yep, practicing other people's kids.
There you go. Student ministry, come get them.
Okay. What are some practical ways people can remember the hope of the gospel as they walk through a season of suffering?
The hope of the gospel. Well, probably it's a hard thing for a person to hear is you are not alone. And that's probably the most important thing a person can hear and believe. You are not alone. You're not only with God, but with a community. And it's hard for a person who's been alone to accept community, because in the past, community has failed them over and over again, especially with trauma. And so for anyone, especially kids, to hear you are not alone is really a big thing for a person to accept.
In the same vein, what are some practical ways the church body can help those facing crisis, pain, or trauma?
To know when they're not being helpful. One of the things, everyone thinks they're helpful is the problem. Research shows that's not true. And so I think it's really to be able to listen to whoever's sitting in front of you and know, okay, I'm listening carefully, nothing's happening. And that you have to almost hear from within, is nothing happening. And usually for me, it means there's no juice, there's no interaction. The other person seems too quiet or too unfocused or too kind of out of it. And that will make me begin to worry, okay, what's happening here? Because usually in therapy, there's always a sense of that something is happening. They're having to reconcile ideas with themselves, which means they're elevated in their anxiety, if you will. That's therapy. So when a person is being too quiet or too just into themselves, then I'm worrying, okay, what's happening in that person to have it be that quiet or that unfocused? Because that's worrisome.
So it's almost like the person who has the opportunity to minister to the person in the midst of trauma has to keep their thoughts captive just as much as the person that needs counseling and needs to want to have care and needs to put in the work to start healing, just as much as the counselee, like the person that has the opportunity to speak into somebody who is hurting needs to know, okay, I need to make sure that I'm not being unhelpful. I'm not saying things that are unhelpful, and making sure that I'm paying attention to, okay, this person's behavior has changed. What's going on here? How do I ask questions that are a ministry to this person and not hurting that person? So that's cool.
Well, look at it this way. If you're talking, the client's not. And therefore, I'm worried then, what are you saying that's going to be useful to the client? So if you're silent, it allows the client to talk. Just from a pragmatic perspective, who has airtime?
Yeah.
For those interested in learning more about trauma-informed counseling or care for students, I will highlight an upcoming event, right? The 2024 Hope Conference. It's going to be at Piedmont Park Alliance Church, January 27th. It's called Trauma-Informed Counseling, a Biblical Perspective. And so by this particular point, you've heard 2 interviews. We did mention last time this particular conference coming in place, but if you want, www.tallycounseling.com. It's a conference put together by the Tallahassee Biblical Counseling Ministries. If you are interested in continuing this learning process that Professor Dr. Smith has introduced to us, I just encourage you to go into that and seek some additional assistance. So on that note, we love you. We thank you for your time. God bless.
Celebration family, thanks for listening.
Be sure to listen to each and every sermon and podcast tied to the SCAR series. God bless.